Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is Jonas Reports for the 13th of May. Well, a little bit of that softness came right back to the previous algo 2867, and so this sideways projection that we were looking for, it's gotten a bit sloppier, but we finally have agreement here. We've reached pretty close to equity amongst them. However, you've started a new run of gold to the upside. So that move should be enough to sustain it, not to mention, we generally know the Fed is going to continue to apply. Do they need to continue to do it at these levels? Not necessarily, but there isn't a big enthusiasm when you have that backstop to get out of anything, because the likelihood is that you can just keep applying with new funds. Now, the question then becomes how much new liquidity is being provided other than borrowed liquidity. That becomes significant, because if you're not going to get the same level of pension contributions and that with the massive reduction in the number of people employed, it's going to have some impact. Not yet, but it's something to be aware of, particularly now you're seeing a real disparity between those economies that want to begin opening and those that don't. Particularly within the U.S., the divide is becoming significant. You have an increased totalitarian fascist version and the one that wants ultimate liberty, or at least just a return to some degree of normalcy. So that is going to continue to brew up. We have the election that's going to get, it's already done, but I think you're going to see it heat up as the next month or two begins, and you're starting to get clarity as to whether or not there's going to be an expansion of the virus or a contraction, and all those mitigating factors. It is interesting, relatively speaking. I think I'll put up the article later. The French use of hydroxychloroquine has gone through the roof in the last several weeks, and so the number of prescriptions is just significantly higher than anywhere else in the world, at a huge decrease from what it was. So we'll have to just take a look at that one as far as therapy-wise goes. But from an NQ standpoint, again, still going to be way better off than the ES, and even still you have cyan under red within that fade. As soon as that steel starts to pick up at all, and the fact that the steel hasn't dipped below negative 13 is still more bullish than not. It's relatively important to note that. Again, euro, it's not going to do anything. They've just put it in a holding pattern. Same thing with oil. You're going to get some variance, but the reality is that the U.S. has dictated that there's going to be a certain amount of supply. The real question is how much activity do we start to see now that some places are starting to open up in the coming week? It's going to take a week or two for that to work through, because people already have an inventory, but new requests for gas and petroleum products going forward is going to be real interesting. Because without, people forget that a lot of oil is used for actual manufacturing and things, plastics and everything else, and not always just for automobile. So that will have a broader impact as things ignite. Gold, again, like I said, it's going to stay in this pattern until there's some fluctuation from a Fed standpoint, either pulling back or an acceleration of the current modality. And so at this particular point, I think that, as we were talking about, just looking forward to head sideways. The shakeout's been relatively consistent with that. It's pretty much eased off. It's not overbought in any way, shape, or form. It's just waiting for a new catalyst. And we're already starting to see the early signs of it. Just the other day, in fact, when I was talking about it, articles were just coming out about food prices rising faster than they have at any other point. That is something that we definitely want to keep an eye on, because if they're related to food shortages, that with supply increases, will that reduce them, or is it just a cost production situation? So that's going to be an interesting one. From an intraday standpoint, of course, we talked about this. We had the positive extremes in that. We started to fill some of those back in. Came across and just plateaued for a while, but the expectation is that we should come back and retest some of these areas again. I don't see us getting too much past some of these in that mid-28 range. And then as the day went on, the war with China started to heat up. And when I say the war with China was declared a bit ago when this whole idea of blame for the virus, and it's going to definitely be a campaign thrust because you've got to have a boogeyman to complain about for anything that goes wrong. So no question that China's going to be that scapegoat. How heated the rhetoric gets, in this particular case, is one thing when you have just an economic disagreement, but this is a disagreement about whether or not you intentionally or even unintentionally inflicted death and destruction upon other countries. So there's going to be some reckoning with that, and as that heats up, I think that's going to scare people. Just because, the volatility of that situation is far greater than it ever was with Russia. Anyone who pays attention to geopolitics knows that. And the Chinese are not going to sit by idly. They're going to have strong rhetoric about it, so that war of words will get pretty heated. Really enjoying, though, what we've got with our paint bars because of the collective nature of the color change in that, the breaking down, when we're getting some of these new buys, even within that weak setup where we're not getting it below white in that and don't have a DOC steel reset coming from underneath red, you can see how that crossover poignantly indicates when you have a failure of any of those little bullish candles, particularly when it all happens around that 23%. It's always tough. If you can't get over that 23% and hold it, you're headed for a worse situation. And sure enough, in this case, as that battle heated up, there was just nothing support-wise. It just was a couple of bars at the 28.92, which had previously been that key support point. And when that broke, that says, hey, oops, nothing's going to happen until we get to our next levels, and we'll have to see where do the big boys step in to actually say, okay, that's enough. And in this particular case, it wasn't until we got back to these same numbers, 28.30. How long have we revisited around this 28.17, 28.30, and then clearly bouncing right about that. If I just pull a little bit past here, we can get a better view of it. There we go. Okay, enlarge this now just a fraction, because that's where we're at right now, and right in the middle of a huge confluence. So we're right back at square one, and I don't think that's going to change. But the ranges within intraday are still spectacular. So this volatility that I talked about is still there, and it's still producing. And I don't really care that it's within the same range, because we like to be able to see that kind of motion, because it just indicates that there's a fluidity taking place. Now, some people could say, well, it's due to lack of liquidity and things like that. Partially, but what it is indicating is there's still a lot of uncertainty. And when a group moves in one direction, everyone tends to follow in that direction until they get tired of that direction. And then when another side takes advantage of what they see as an imbalance, they're really going after it. And so it just gives us nice fluid runs, and then in between those fluid runs, you get a bunch of just chop back and forth with just a lot of sideways action. So that's generally what I would be looking for going forward, and I think it's going to continue to be the same, which is not bad. It's just, it is what it is. So you have to accept that and just be flexible with it. As always, though, trade well. We'll talk to you later.